Hey everybody, it's Nate and Steph from Explorers.life. We teach people how to build DIY campers. Welcome to episode 2 of our Crosstrek camper build series. This is a long video, so we're skipping out our normal intro and are getting right into the tutorial, how to install a rough country lift onto a 2016 Subaru Crosstrek. This video should be used in conjunction with the instructions we've made into a blog post, as we can add clarification to the blog post after publishing, where we can't exactly do that with this video. Let's get started. The first thing we did was to take some before measurements for comparison's sake, where we found that we had 10.5 inches of clearance to the rocker panels and 8.5 inches to the engine skid plate. We then disconnected the negative battery terminal, set the parking brake, and chocked the rear wheels. We broke the lug nuts loose and used our floor jack to lift the car. There are 2 little notches on the pinch welds behind each front tire. This is where we'll place our jack stands to rest the car while we work. Next, we finished removing the wheels. And finally coated the bolts to remove with PB Blaster.
So we're going to remove the ABS cable here and the brake line here. So to do that, we're going to need just a pry bar, a 12mm socket and ratchet, and a 12mm wrench. There's some clips on either side of these that what's easiest to do is just push one of them in and get it kind of cockeyed. And get your pry bar in there and just ever so gently wiggle it back and forth until it comes loose. Next, we're going to remove the brake line from the strut. Now we're going to remove the sway bar end link from the control arm, and that will just help us get some more room in here as we put the strut back on. So for this, we're going to need a 6mm Allen key and a 17mm wrench. The Allen key fits into the end of the end link stud and holds it in place so we can remove the nut. Then we separated the end link from the control arm completely. Next, we're going to remove these 2 bolts to remove this whole assembly down. But before we do that, we need to make some reference marks on this top bolt. And that will get us close to alignment, even though you're going to definitely need an alignment done after this lift is complete. We want to get it back close, and making that reference mark on this bolt will get you close to it. Now that we have our reference points marked, we are going to take these 2 bolts off. We're going to need a 19mm wrench and socket. This would also be a good time for a breaker bar because these are going to be a beast of a bolt to get off.
Oh, stop. Bam, there it is.
All needed.
And we're out.
Next thing we need to do is remove these 3 nuts from the top of the strut, and that is with a 12mm socket.
Okay.
Now that the strut is out of the car, we need to secure the strut spacer to the top of the strut with the Subaru factory nuts.
So we got the spacer on top of the strut and we're about to put it in place. So there's something to notice on this spacer. There's a little notch right here, and that needs to go towards the outside of the car, towards the front. So basically this is going to be this way. This bolt here is going to be that direction. And then so we're just going to fit this up in here and then line everything up. Steph is going to be up top, and we are going to get going with that. The rough country instructions don't tell you to undo the tie rod end link. When we tried reinstalling the strut with the end link still attached, the strut simply would not fit back into place. So if you're following their instructions step by step and are having issues with this step, undo the sway bar end link and see if that helps. So now that we got that in place, we are going to reassemble these bolts here exactly the same way that we disassembled it. So just pay attention when you disassemble it, reassemble it the same way.
Converter. Now that everything is all connected, we're going to take our torque wrench and torque everything down to their specifications. Last thing to do is to reconnect the ABS cable and the brake line. And the actual last thing to do is to put the tire back on.
Starting on the back with the front wheels chocked, lift the car with the floor jack and place your jack stands between the two notches in the pinch welds in front of the rear tire and remove the wheels. To access the tops of the rear struts, you'll need to remove the floor in the cargo area.
Well, that broke. Didn't break.
The clips and the styrofoam surrounding the spare tire, and the rear shock tower cover trim pieces. Next, you'll loosen and remove both nuts on the tops of the rear struts accessed from the trunk area of the car. So now that we're all finished up with the front, we're going to move to the back. We've already jacked up the back of the car. We've already secured it on the jack stands. And now I'm just going to talk through what we're actually trying to accomplish back here, because the instructions are pretty useless, to be totally honest. But by the time you guys are seeing this video, we will have made our own instructions and we'll have that on the website, so you can find that there. But let's talk about what we're trying to do here. So this is the back of the car. We already have the back end of the suspension supported by the jack. The jack is simply sitting on the bottom of the rear differential. It is not holding up the car, it is simply holding up the back end of the suspension system with just the tiniest amount of pressure. Moving around here to the other side of the car, there's a few points that are going to achieve this lift. And we're going to be putting a spacer at the top of this strut. We're going to be putting a spacer here, and we're going to be putting a spacer here, and then we're going to have to remove this plate right here. It's just a plastic plate, so we can access the long arm that's attached to here. You'll also be placing a spacer here and here. So now that we've talked through what we're going to do here, if it's not quite clear yet, be sure to just check the blog post, because I'm going to have more pictures and what all of these components are and where all the bolts are, with little arrows pointing to everything. That hopefully it'll clear it up. But I told you what we're going to do. We're going to do it, and then I'll show you what we did after it to hopefully make this as clear as we possibly can. So this is the plate that we're trying to remove. It's this right here, because we need to access this long bar right here. So there are 12 millimeter bolts right here, here, and then a few up here that I can't really see this very second. But once you start taking these apart, this will all wiggle free and you'll be able to tell where they are. Safety glasses are key with that. Now that's out of the way. So to remove this bar, we need to take this bolt, this bolt, this bolt, and this bolt out. And these are all 12 millimeter. Now that's out of the way, keep these bolts and this bar together because we'll be reinstalling these. So for spatial awareness, looking from the wheel well, the next thing we're going to do is we need to disconnect this bar right here. There's 2 bolts at the front of it, and then that's the next step for now. This is that same bar that I was just talking about from the top side. It's just viewed from the bottom side now. The 2 bolts we'll be removing are right here and right here. And that's going to be done with a 14 millimeter socket. Now that those 2 are out, I'm going to bring the camera back up to the top. And again, what we were just working on was the front of this piece right here. The next one we need to do is we need to undo the bolt that's on the bottom of this here. And we'll just go ahead and do that, and then I'll show you the next steps. Now this, we're just going to loosen it for now. Coming back up top, we are going to need to do the same thing to this bolt that's on the bottom right here. And same as the other one, this is also a 19 millimeter. And again, we're just loosening it, not removing it just yet. So the next thing we need to talk about is we have quite a bit of hardware going on here, and this is for the most part how everything needs to be arranged. You have these bigger spacers here, and these require the bigger bolt of the package. Have a smaller spacer here. This requires the smallest bolt in the package. You've got these body puck spacers, and then they require the longest bolts in the package. There's 4 of those, and on each one, regardless of which one it is, you're going to have the bolt, you're going to have a lock washer, and then you're going to have a washer. And just assemble these like this, just to stay nice and organized, and next we'll talk about where these actually need to go. So moving back to this side of the car, we have this bolt that we undid right there, and then we have the one we undid right down there. And these are going to go in those 2 locations. These medium-sized spacers are going to go the front side of this cradle brace that we undid, those 2 bolts up there. This is going to fit between the cradle brace and the body. And these small spacers here, these are going to go on the front side of this long bar that we uninstalled. Remember, this is where we attach this to the cradle brace that is going to be attached to this for the most part. But that's kind of the general layout. We're going to start installing all of this, and hopefully we'll tie it all together and let it make even more sense. So now everything is loosened up, and the parts that need to be totally disconnected are already totally disconnected. The next part is going to be about lowering this entire subframe structure. The pieces that we did on this side, the parts that we undid and we loosened, I've already gone through and I've done the exact same thing on the other side, total mirror image, so that's already done. So now the entire suspension system is pretty much supported by the floor jack. Everything is still attached, so if we drop the floor jack, it would still stay in place. All the suspension would still stay in place. But now we need to start dropping things individually and inserting the spacers where they need to go. So now we are going to be slowly and methodically, one side at a time, one piece at a time, lowering this bolt that's under here, because we need to put that body puck right in there. We need to put our spacer up here. See if we can focus on it. We need to put the spacer right here, the square one. That body puck goes right here. And then on this side, this body puck goes up here. So we're going to be undoing this bolt, and this bolt. And it's just going to be a matter of doing it kind of sort of one at a time, the best we can. Ultimately, I'm going to go do it now, and I'll video it, kind of time lapse it, and then we'll talk about it after it's already done. Now that the front body bolt is removed, we need to further loosen the rear body bolt to free up some space at the front body bolt. Lowering the floor jack should give us plenty of space. So I just lowered the suspension, and that's going to give us enough room to put our spacers, our body spacers, up here where they need to be on the front side. Just like that. So now that we have this first spacer in, it's in place, this bolt is in place, we're going to leave it loose because we're going to move on to the back one. Going to remove this bolt, drop this down, put the spacer in, put in the new bolt, just like on the front. So now that this bolt is in place, I need to go do the exact same thing to the other side. Those same 3 spacers, it's just going to be mirrored on the other side. So I will check back in once that's done and we'll move on to the next steps. So now that we have all 3 of the spacers on each side of the Crosstrek, we have one more spacer to install, and it's this little guy right here. And that goes on this brace. Remember this thing? This was the one that we removed, pretty much the very first thing we removed from out front of the car. This basically goes up underneath this cradle brace that we put this spacer underneath towards the front, and this is going to sit on here like this at the front of the Crosstrek. So we're going to put this in place right now. And then this spacer just sits right here on top of this bar and bolts to the original location. Great, so now I'm going to go do the exact same thing on the other side, and I will be right back. So every bolt and nut that has been untightened or added on the build so far needs to be torqued down. Got these torque wrenches here, and I'm just going to go around and find the manufacturer's specs and what's recommended for all of the torque specifications. I'm just going to time lapse over that because I think it's going to be more helpful if you just go to the blog post, and I will put all of the torque specs on there. Otherwise, it's just going to get cumbersome. So I'm going to do that, time lapse it. I'll be right back. So I'm back sooner than expected. This long brace, the last thing that we installed, this one right here. When you install that, you lose access to this bolt right here that we need to torque down. So I'm going to have to back up just a little bit, and I'm going to have to remove these braces and torque down the furthest to the rear bolt in the back. And I will make sure that I put this in the blog post, but hopefully you guys are watching this entire video and not doing it just as a step-by-step kind of thing, so you get to see what I messed up on and how I'm fixing it. But I'm going to take this off and then torque it down. Am I saying twerking or torquing? It's really tough to say. Anyway, I'm going to remove this and then tighten it down fully, and then I'll be back. Everything is now properly torqued down to spec, And now we have a few more bolts to remove because we need to put the spacer on top of the strut. So let's get to it. Next thing we need to do is we need to get the strut out of the car. And to do that, we need to lower this control arm here. So in order to do that, we need to loosen this bolt, undo this bolt, undo this bolt, and undo this bolt. This is a 17 millimeter, 17 millimeter, 14 millimeter, and 17 millimeter. What's going to happen when we do this is this whole arm is going to pivot down this direction, and it's going to allow us to get the strut right here out of the car. So in a minute, I'm going to be putting a jack underneath to support this side so it doesn't come crashing down whenever tension is fully released. But I'm kind of sort of going to time lapse it because it's pretty straightforward as we're just undoing these 3 bolts fully, removing them, and just loosening this one. Let's get to it. And it takes a little bit of finesse with the floor jack to get these out so that they're not under tension whenever you're pulling these bolts out. So a quick tip, I think it's best if you loosen all of them first, and then you remove this one first, then remove this one, and then remove this one. It kind of puts this one in a little bit of a bind if you try to take this bolt out before you take this one out. So now that this is dropped, we can get our strut out of here pretty easily. Just like that. Now let's take it over to the workbench and install the strut spacer. So the next thing we need to do is we need to install these studs into this strut spacer. It doesn't come pre-installed, so we have to do it ourselves. What that ends up looking like is something similar to that, and it's just pushed on. We're going to be installing it on this one here, and this is the stud, and there's 2 holes here. One of them is big, and you would think that would be the right size, but ultimately it's too big. It actually has to go in the one it doesn't fit in. I know that doesn't make a lot of sense, but let me show you how that works. So we just need to force this into place. So we're going to line up this stud. We're going to take a punch and a hammer and smack it until it goes in there past the threads. Now what we need to do is we need to clamp this to our workstation with a C-clamp. To pull it the rest of the way on, we have an extra bolt that came in that package that's actually too big for much of anything, and you'll know it when you see it. And then one of the other bolts that is designed to go on this. So what we're going to do is we're going to use this as a spacer, slide that over that bolt, and then we are going to use this to force this stud into this spacer. I'll show you how to do that. So you're just going to grab a 15 millimeter wrench and start turning this nut onto this stud. And now that's done, we can take this bolt off of this stud. Just like that. And now we have a fully assembled strut spacer. So next thing we need to do is install the strut spacer on the top of here. And all that involves is putting this on top of here, just like this, and using the supplied nuts and putting them on top of there in place. So installed, it's going to look like this. The next thing we need to do is torque this down to 30 foot-pounds, and let's get to it. So this simply just slides back up into place pretty much the exact same way. Getting this in place is a lot easier than it was on the front of the car. So something that'll make it easier to get this up into place is to drop this control arm all the way to the ground. And then use the floor jack to hold the control arm in place once you get the strut back up through the holes into the trunk. And now into the trunk area, we need to reinstall these nuts onto the tops of the struts. We're just going to put them on finger tight for now, and we tighten everything up later. So the next thing that we need to do is we need to reinstall these bolts that we uninstalled just a minute ago. Pretty much the exact same way. I'm probably going to start with this one, and then finally this one, letting the jack kind of help me prop it back up. When you do this, don't tighten these down all the way just yet. We're going to tighten everything down once the car is actually on the ground, so the suspension can settle back to where it needs to be just a little bit. So these three, not all the way tightened down, and let's get to it. So it is all installed. The way I ended up doing it was I ended up doing this one first and then these two. These little bolts have little points on the end of them that help it guide it into the hole a little bit easier than this one up here. Still ultimately kind of a pain in the ass to get everything to line up, but I've also done the other side as well. It's the exact same process, just mirror image. Everything is just slightly more than finger tight. We actually torque all this stuff down once it's on the ground, and I believe it's time to lower this thing down. So we're going to put the wheels and tires back on and lower it down. The last thing we need to do before we lower the car is going to be install this brake line extender bracket. So let's put it on. We want to put the extender adapter on the brake line holder. Just thread that through like that. Tighten it up with a 13mm wrench and socket. And then you're going to use the same bolt that came out of it the first time around and reattach the bracket to the suspension. Finally, we want to remove the wheel chocks, release the parking brake, and reattach the negative battery cable. To get the suspension to settle back into place, you want to roll the car back and forth 150 times or until you get tired, whichever comes first. Every bolt and nut that has been untightened or added on the build so far needs to be torqued down. I'm going to do that. I'll be right back. The last things to do were to reinstall the interior trim pieces, lay the floor back down, and load up the new tires to go get them installed and have an alignment done. But first, here's a before shot with the stock tires installed with the lift. And an after shot with the bigger tires installed. We took a new set of measurements from the same spots as before, and it's looking like we have gained about 3 inches total between the 2 inches of lift plus 1 inch of taller tire radius. Here are a few more before after shots from a few different angles. Now maybe you're wondering more about the tires, but I have more to say about them, and this video is already at 30 minutes, so I think it's worth a totally separate video, as we did have to do a little bit of trimming to fit. All I'll say about these tires in this video is that they're 225/65 R17 Bridgestone Blizzak WS80s mounted on the stock Crosstrek rims. So if you want to see that video, be sure to subscribe and check out next Sunday's video. If this video helped you out, be sure to give it a thumbs up and share it with somebody who could use it, and we will see you in the next video.